There was a lot of fanfare that surrounded the first human to have made it to the academy, though it wasn't because they were particularly well liked or studious. Nor was it because they were in some way infamous or unsavory. In fact, they simply hadn't had enough time to make an impact either way, as they'd emerged through the portal dead on arrival. It was a known fact that humans were just inherently magically deficient. Their race was the last of the adjacent realms to have even detected the existence of magic after all, let alone learning of the Nexus' existence. What wasn't expected, however, was just how truly deficient they actually were, as the death of the first human student was directly attributed to their inability to not only control, but to resist the effects of latent mana. A feat that was supposed to be inherent in all living things, as the soul naturally projected a mana field which prevented the flow of latent mana from entering or passing through it. Yet members of the faculty and staff present at the tragedy could attest to this universal truth being missing in the humans, or at least the human student, as his soul projected nothing, causing what should have been harmless mana to simply seep through him like a filter, destroying the physical body and mortally wounding the intangible spirit in the process. Now, decades after traumatizing an entire class of students, some of whom have now become faculty and staff themselves, the humans seem confident enough to follow through with a second try. So, as morning gave way to noon, and noon to dusk, the crowd of freshman intakes from across the realms were carefully sorted and filed out of the foyer, leaving the most problematic for last. Yet news had already spread about the human due for arrival. Whether it was a passing comment made by a faculty member or a coincidental rumor run amok, the damage was already done. Now, almost every student from freshman to senior began making their way back to the academy's main concourse for a chance to peek and gawk at the humans' arrival in morbid curiosity. Yet most that attempted this trek would only find themselves trapped in a maze of hallways that weren't supposed to exist. Indeed, many would somehow find themselves inadvertently redirected back to the seminarium, or worse, straight to the dean's office for disobeying the one unspoken rule of the day: no entry back into the foyer after dusk. Whilst a simple lock would have sufficed, the faculty refused to take any chances with the human arrival this time around. A repeat of the first human arrival would not happen again, especially when a few of the faculty present were there for that gruesome arrival all those years ago. So even as mana stores were drained for the purposes of this elaborate barrier, it would all be worth it. This year's roster of freshman students were a particularly noteworthy collection of nobility and even royalty. A velvet glove approach was necessary to maintain some level of decorum even as the rumors continued to circulate. Nobles naturally detested being told what they could or could not do after all. Yet despite their best efforts, a few of the more magically gifted did manage to find a way through. Making their way across hidden passageways and corridors, nominally hidden by a lesser cloaking spell, these gifted students eventually ended up in a small servant's hideaway usually reserved for the lesser elves. Those few that managed to evade the faculty's barriers were extraordinarily blessed by the Great Mother. Their magical potential overpowering or outright shorting out the otherwise strained and preoccupied barrier spells erected by the scant few professors and staff assigned to the task of overseeing the reception of this prospective human student. The Lesser Elf Hideaway. What was euphemistically referred to as a hideaway was nothing more than a hole in the wall the size of a large broom closet, yet lacking in even the height department in that regard. It was a far departure from the glitz, glamour, and comforts that the three freshmen were more than likely accustomed to, but that didn't detract from the one perk that drew them here in the first place, a rather worrying rumor that they'd inadvertently proven right. These rooms did have a disturbingly good vantage point of the large, open public spaces within the castle grounds. Yet as much as there was to discuss this strange myth being proven true, all of it took a back seat as the much more pressing concern of the human arrival took center stage. The three gifted freshmen, a Lupiner mercenary prince, a Venerian court noble, and an Aviner princess, struggled to find common ground despite having been immediately shunned by the rest of their gifted compatriots for reasons far beyond their personal control. Whilst misery did love company, it would seem as if there were too many differences to reconcile, at least within the span of the few short hours following arrival and orientation. Eleanor, for the Great Mother's sake, if you don't find yourself another spot, I will bite you. The tall, fully grown Lupiner spoke, his row of razor-sharp teeth barely hidden underneath his lupin-like snout. The growling and snarling certainly did not help his species' less than stellar reputation as brutes and savages. Even his title, the Mercenary Prince, hinted at their people's troubled past. A past that not many were willing to overlook, as evidenced by their inability to shake their mercenary monikers. Bite me, and I'll have your flea-ridden hide suspended, expelled, and excommunicated from the Academy and the Nexus. The smaller, diminutive Venerian snapped back, which seemed almost comical given his stature and his kind's general disposition that much more resembled their second-rate kobold cousins. Yet the Venerian were anything but second-rate. Through displays of wealth and extravagance they made certain that all who came into contact with them understood the clearly defined line between them and the kobolds they so very much still resembled. The school uniform certainly did nothing but detract from whatever distinct features Eleanor had, however, as by most metrics he could easily pass as a simple kobold playing dress-up in academy regalia. Guys, I think we should keep it down. You're making too much of a fuss, and if the professors notice us. Shut it, the Saya. If we wanted to taint its opinion, then we would have asked for it. The Venerian practically spat back, shooting down the Aviner's concerns as she slumped back into the background once more, something that she was more than accustomed to back in the royal court. The Aviner were a particularly well-regarded race that had little in the way of conflict with any other species from across the realms. Compared to the rest of the gaggle of freshmen here, nothing about her particularly stood out, especially under the cloaks and uniforms assigned by the Academy. Nothing, except for the two sharp, predatory eyes that stared unblinkingly out from their small cubby hole into the foyer below. Indeed, underneath the constrictive shirts, pants, and cloaks lay a plumage that served as inspiration for many a mural and fresco within the Academy's great halls. The Aviner were nothing if not stunning when in their element, an element that was certainly lacking when she found herself struggling to fit inside the cramped and unkempt servants' quarters. Yet as much as her plumage would undeniably tie her back to her royal heritage, and as much as the cloaks covered even that, nothing could hide the taint that lingered over her. A miasmic aura that colored her mana field with a dark, almost ominous glow. One that contrasted with both the Lupiner and the Venerian's bright, almost iridescent mana fields. The three struggled to find footing as they stared out from what seemed to be a particularly well-designed peephole that granted them an uninterrupted view of the foyer below and the group of black, red, and blue-cloaked professors who were busy with the incantations necessary to maintain the uncharacteristically weak and fragile portal. The foyer. Adorned more like a palace than a center of learning, the foyer was where students from across the adjacent realms would find themselves transported to at the start of each academic year. Its marble and quartz floors could be traced back to the first kings and queens of the Nexus. Its gilded chandeliers were likewise gifts from kingdoms and empires long since forgotten to time. Indeed, within these four walls lie a great volume of artifacts that no adjacent realm could hope to match. Yet despite all of this grandeur and assurances to the Academy's infallibility, the trio of professors worked tirelessly to ensure that this air of perfection would not be broken. Surely we do not need to perform a fifth blessing upon this entire room, Professor Vanavan. The red-cloaked professor spoke incredulously, whilst busying herself with what seemed to be an entire crate full of glowing, sparkling vials of pure mana extract. Of course we do. The humans are like a sickly newborn, they require the extra help, all the extra help they can get. The blue-robed professor spoke, his elvish accent coming through particularly harshly, especially under the stressful circumstances. We know how magically challenged they are, and we know how magic can pierce their non-existent mana fields, straight into their unprotected souls. We all saw what happened to the first student we lost. We cannot allow chance to dominate what could very well be the next realm to join the Nexus. The Earth realm is nothing but untapped potential, so should they become the next in our line of adjacent realms. With all due respects, Professor, if humans are that sickly, perhaps we should let nature take its course. I mean, look around, the only witnesses would be us, and we could very much easily claim a no-show on the humans' end," announced the only black-robed professor present, and rather concerningly, one of the few who spoke with the authority of the Privy Council. Black robes rotated on a year-by-year basis, being appointed not by the dean or the faculty but by the Royal Privy Council itself. Their positions only existed because of a lingering clause that came with the messily written treaty that ended the centuries-long conflict between the beings native to the Nexus realm and those of the adjacent realms. Well, if they do make it, Professor Maltori, then I'd hazard to say that you might actually have something productive to report to the Privy Council, instead of the usual student roster reports and the occasional suspension. Vanavan snapped back. A harshness to his voice was evident as the two began a fierce stare-down that lasted for a scant few seconds, before, finally, the air around them started to cool. "They're coming." The red-robed professor spoke warily, as she began removing seal after seal that kept her various raw mana stores from simply sublimating. Almost as soon as each seal was uncorked from the unmarked, unlabeled vials, so too would the mana be violently drawn out, all concentrated around the incantation circle that continued to drain localized mana from the whole foyer at an alarming rate. Indeed, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to even say that the professors felt mana being tugged from their very mana fields, if it wasn't for their advanced magics keeping such disturbances at bay. The mana drain was so incredibly strong that the magically lit lanterns adorning the colonnades began to dim, before going out entirely, leaving the entirety of the room in pitch-black darkness. Silence now reigned as the trio of professors concentrated their energies into forming the portal into a more cohesive shape, trying desperately to fight back against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm them. All of this happened in complete and abject silence until suddenly, snap! In a violent, almost unexpected display of brute force, the portal opened just wide enough to allow not only for a single figure to materialize through, but for a glimpse of the world the creature had just arrived from to be visible to all within its immediate vicinity. It was a world of cold, bland, oppressive grays and blacks. A world full of metal railings and metal walls, of strange metal contraptions, golems, and electrical energy shooting back and forth across entire spaces in a dizzying array of overactivity. It was a decidedly alien world, one that the professors were glad to have only glimpsed at briefly, as the trio all struggled to stand after that entire experience. All were so overwhelmed by this experience that they overlooked the monster that had just landed on their doorstep. What could only be described as a hulking behemoth that matched the blue-robed elf's height of just under 7 feet. The beast was clad in armor thicker than most ceremonial knights, with equally thick padding underneath. A helmet of incredible craftsmanship sat atop of all of this, with a single, flexible tube connecting its side with a large, metal backpack that looked as unwieldy as it was cumbersome. 2 blue-tinted opaque lenses now stared back at the professors as the beast raised a single hand and slowly began to wave. "Hi. I'm Emma. The new student from Earth? There was once a time when I liked fantasy. A time when things were simpler, and the world just seemed like one big adventure waiting to be undertaken. I'd grown up on newsreels of the first interstellar drives to break the warp V-limit and films that documented the first landings on habitable worlds not of our own design. I'd spent hours upon hours on the soft, carpeted floors of my living room, reading and fantasizing about hidden worlds just beyond the snowy forests that flanked our small 2-story home. Not a weekend was spent without me and my parents regaling each other with tales of heroes and kingdoms in far-off lands. Not a season was spent without a new hyperfixation, a new campaign to be played between schoolwork and chores. I was living a fantasy until one chilly autumn morning when it all came crashing down. One phone call was all it took. A single conversation ripped a line between what I'd call my idyllic youth and the wake-up call that was my teens. In the weeks that followed, I watched as the world around me was torn apart. Relatives and adults I barely knew began barging in and picking apart the warmth and comfort that had been my home. Family photos stored in boxes, shelves emptied and dismantled, the attic where Mom and I would go on adventures to kingdoms and faraway lands, cleared out without hesitation. The spaces and places that I had once known slowly transformed into a hollow shell of themselves as the days and weeks went by. Until they finally took me as well, away from the only place I knew, and then only life I'd known. I never saw my home again. I never even set foot in my hometown after I was relocated to my distant aunt's apartment in the city. Sometimes I even wondered if my memories of that small town life were all part of the fantastical stories I'd grown up with, because imagining a world so perfect, so untouched by everything, was almost too fantastical in and of itself. Plaster and wallpapered walls replaced the warm oaks and pines I once took for granted. A skyline soaring hundreds upon hundreds of stories overhead likewise became the norm, as was the finely manicured park that was a 20-minute subway ride away from the apartment I now called home. No longer could I just exit the kitchen to find an expansive open yard surrounded by a dense patch of conifers, and no longer could I spend hours upon hours staring out the little nook in the front porch's windowsill, gazing as the seasons shifted from one to the other. The city was a whole different beast, and it was one that I'd grown to love, in a strange sort of way. People here wouldn't bother you, even if you were in the middle of a crowd of thousands or an apartment complex filled with thousands more. The faces all blended together, everyone was too busy forging their own paths in life, so much so that I found it difficult to form any attachments. It's been an entire decade since I left my childhood behind, and I can proudly say that I've come to call the concrete jungle my new home. My caseworkers told me that many people in my situation would prefer to retreat further into fantasy and fiction, but I did the exact opposite. The illusion of fiction was just too much to bear after having the rug torn from under me. So I focused on what mattered instead, real life. I was running on autopilot, as some of my friends would say. I got good enough grades at school, volunteered in extracurriculars as decorative pieces for my college application, and did what was expected of me. I needed to move on from what I lost. I wanted to leave that past behind in any way I could. I found structure and direction in the JROTC, and from what few conversations my aunt and I had, it was clear she agreed with me, not surprising given how she was a veteran of the Jovian uprisings. Yet I wouldn't have expected that my journey into the military would lead me to a fate that further entangled me with a past I so desperately wished to move beyond. Indeed, I wasn't expecting what was supposed to be the start to my college life to be a backtrack into fantasy. == The Institute for Anomalous Studies, Earth. 10 months prior to arrival. Director Laura Weir. Emma was the perfect candidate. A 19-year-old college freshman with an impeccable academic record, alongside commendations on her JROTC reports. This alone wouldn't have made her stand out if it wasn't for the fact that she had little in the way of familial or social attachments. This latter factor was especially vital, given the sensitive nature of this operation. An operation that would see the greatest risk ever undertaken by a single human being, second only to the perilous flights of humanity's first FTL-capable vessels. An operation that would indeed see her flung into a great, perilous unknown, disconnected and completely cut off from the rest of civilization, just like those brave pioneers centuries ago. Whilst the first human flights into the great unknown were preceded and accompanied by much fanfare, this great leap, however, would not. For it presents a risk far greater than any FTL experiment ever could, carrying with it the weight of an existential threat we've been tasked with studying and neutralizing. For centuries now, we've been observing, tracking, analyzing, and studying what is undeniable evidence of a world parallel to our own. A world that lurks just underneath the surface, that served as a source of myths and legends for our ancestors, and that continues to serve as a limitless pool of inspiration to those gifted enough to peer across the veil, inadvertently acting as a source of inspiration for countless works of fantasy and fiction. Indeed, this world would have been left at that, fiction, if it wasn't for us. Shunned and practically excommunicated by the scientific community, our outlandish claims were pushed aside as the march of progress continued ever onwards. Even so, as evidence began to stack, and as proof continued to mount, we eventually garnered the attention of the United Nations Science Advisory, who eventually saw fit to incorporate us into what is now the IAS. What we discovered was irrefutable evidence of what could only be described as a world of magic and sorcery, a fantasy world by every metric, and one that had the potential to upend our own. It was because of this existential threat that every resource was eventually poured into peering deeper into this world and its non-analogous scientific principles. Yet the more we tried peering in, the less information we got back. It was a battle of diminishing returns that lasted for centuries before we finally made a breakthrough. Our equivalent of discovering the Rosetta Stone. We discovered a means of communicating with the powers on the other side of the fence, and indeed, we later discovered this was intentional. The journey we'd been on for the past few centuries, the discovery of this puzzle, as they called it, was all a test. It was a test to determine the magical potential for those gifted from other worlds. Indeed, it was a test that was considered commonplace and had been in place for what was described to us as eons now. We were just late to the party. Mumbles were heard on the other side discussing how we technically weren't ever expected to pass this test, given how magically deficient our species naturally were. It was later revealed to us that every other civilization in our own galaxy had long since passed, and that we were effectively the last to follow suit. As a result, we would be the last to enter this realm of magic and sorcery. This perhaps explained why it was that we had detected no other technologically advanced civilizations, even as we developed FTL and roamed the galaxy for intelligent life. Theories abound on how this divergent pathway could have stagnated technological development, but that was a story for another day. Our correspondences led us to the understanding that upon completion of this test, that a single candidate be sent through the threshold for further evaluation before their host civilization was allowed to fully peer into this great unknown. It called for a candidate of 19 years of age, of any rank and station, with what they described to us as a heart of gold and a willingness to accept what is beyond the known, and willing to sacrifice everything should it come to it. Yet as we sent our first candidate through the threshold, it was clear that not only were we magically deficient, but that magic was actively rejecting us. Despite being in full PPE that should have protected against every hazard known to science, our first candidate was returned to us in a near unrecognizable state. An autopsy revealed the signs of a breakdown of cellular matrices at a microscopic level, and what would only be described as near liquefaction of our first human candidate. But after some time was allowed for grieving, alongside whatever cover stories were needed to keep this under wraps, we knew we had to try again. It was decided then that we would spend however much more time was necessary in order to study, probe, and poke at the dangers that lie beyond this threshold, in order to best counter it using every tool at our disposal. Decades, and after what we hoped weren't lethal doses of mana radiation later, we finally pulled it off. The ultimate expression of human defiance against an environment that would see us dead without an iota of empathy or compassion. The culmination of centuries of work, of sacrifice and hardship, the mark Ixoriality and Atypical Radiation Resistant Suit, EARRS, or what most in the team now colloquially referred to as the Enchanted Power Armor. Based on the framework of modern power armor expressly designed for combat in the vacuum of space, the suit was nothing short of a technological marvel. Layers upon layers of exotic materials protected the wearer from a total of 29 distinct types of magical radiation. A hermetically sealed oversuit and helmet prevented any exposure to the air and kept any foreign contaminants, be it biological or chemical, from coming into contact with the wearer. Pieces of composite armor were attached almost identically to the original design, with all of this weight carefully distributed and compensated by an exoskeleton sandwiched between the undersuit and oversuit, hence the term power armor. Gauntlet-mounted laser and kinetic personal defense weapons were attached to both arms, despite the other side calling for the candidate to be sent unarmed. Despite all this effort, a candidate was still needed to cross the threshold. And that's where Emma comes in. The Institute for Anomalous Studies, Earth. 10 minutes prior to arrival. Emma Booker. To say that the situation presented to me all those months ago was nothing short of unreal would be an understatement. Indeed, for a while I had assumed me being taken here was part of some elaborate PsyOps recruitment drive targeted at new unsuspecting members of the ROTC. It took hours before I was finally convinced that this entire situation was what the director claimed it to be. I should have guessed as much though, because I doubt grabbing a college freshman straight out of a parking lot and into the back seat of a blacked-out SUV was anything but standard protocol. The offer presented before me was something that no other human in history had ever been given. The opportunity to travel not just beyond the speed of light or beyond the galactic quadrant, but to a whole other dimension. It was a world of, as the director had put it herself, swords and sorcery, of indescribable history and culture, a world that I fundamentally had no interest in. Yet still, somehow, drew me in despite my desire to escape its allure. Perhaps this was the real reason why they chose me. Perhaps this was why, out of the countless more candidates they probably had, I would be the one to don the encounter suit. Perhaps they knew that I just couldn't help but to accept such an offer. Indeed, even I didn't know why I signed up without hesitation. Perhaps it was because I craved to follow the motions of what was expected of me. Perhaps it was a latent drive to tap into that childhood fantasy. Perhaps it was just that innate human spirit of adventure, of breaking yet another barrier that stood in the way of human progress. Whatever it was, I knew that by signing I was more than likely never going to see home, family, or friends again for at least a whole year while attending this academy on the other side of the portal. So much for my plans for college. Who knows, maybe they'll accept transfer credits. The loss of contact with friends and family didn't bother me that much. It wasn't as if I had any tangible attachments anywhere anyways. The military was what gave me purpose in recent years, and it would be the military that would be backing me up in this adventure going forward. If anything, I would have all to gain and nothing to lose from this venture. So, with a single stroke of a pen, the grueling training began in earnest. It was months of specialized training, focusing on theory, protocol, but most important of all, the practical instructions necessary for a life of prolonged suiting. The power armor was described to me as being more akin to a spacesuit, and it was promptly drilled into me that it would be the only barrier between myself and the other dimension's unrepentantly volatile environment. How any native civilization, let alone species, had managed to evolve and survive there I did not know. What I did know, however, was that an entire year of being cooped up in PPE would be challenging to say the very least. Which was also why I was given a sort of inflatable tent. One that had the same mana-resistant properties as the suit, but with the downsides of being unbelievably fragile, so fragile that even an off-the-counter kitchen knife could pose a real threat to it. Yet it would be my only respite in between prolonged periods of suiting, and would be required for routine maintenance when the time did call for it. Weapons, survival, and tactical exercises were all part of the training regimen, all with a heavy emphasis on the suit's various subsystems. A fine piece of technology that I was beginning to grow fond of, given the lengths that the UN's best and brightest have gone to transform an EVA workhorse into a platoon's worth of force projection. Yet training and briefing on the other dimension was worryingly lacking. The director herself admitted that we were going in half blind, with far less than they would have liked to work off of. It was admittedly up to me to make up for the lack of intel and situational adaptability and personal initiative. I wanted to tell her that would be easier said than done, but given the circumstances, I held back on it. Eventually, however, the time did come for my training, my skills, and my resolve to be put to the ultimate test. As I stood there in the middle of a lab straight out of a science fiction movie, with administrative staff, military attachés, and leading scientific minds all hiding behind a veritable bunker that overlooked a room filled to the brim with monitoring equipment and strange runic markings on the floor. Whatever happens, cadet, know that you're making history, and that you're making your country, your people, and the entirety of the human race proud. Out of the 252 billion humans in this galaxy, you will be one of the only 2 to have stepped through this threshold. The director spoke an arousing speech which elicited a few claps from behind her as I responded with a single thumbs up and a nod. Neil Armstrong, Peter Lee, Jean Rousseau, and Eleanor Sobek all had something to say before they made their big leaps forward, didn't they? I asked, as the portal before me started to grow in increasing size and intensity. If I can even be compared to any of them, that is, I'd like to say something as well. Whatever it is, you better make it a quick one, cadet. The portal's about to reach criticality. Humanity has always reached for the stars, reaching ever outwards towards the heavens. Today, humanity reaches beyond the stars, beyond the heavens, into the pages of fiction itself. Equals 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 equals. The Transgression Academy for the Magical Arts, Nexus. Emma Booker. It happened almost instantly. In fact, it felt as if nothing had happened at all, as all I saw was the drab concrete and composite walls suddenly disappearing for a split second, only to be replaced with a room that looked like it was pulled straight from a recreation of Versailles. It was the same feeling you'd get when leaving one room and entering another, except without ever actually physically moving at all. My eyes had barely adjusted to that sudden shift in my surroundings before I was met face to face with what could only be described as three humanoid figures pulled straight from a fantasy novel. They all stared at me with the same shocked expression I probably had underneath the opaque lenses of the helmet. Yet as I noticed their robed figures, and most importantly, the distinct coloration between each of them, it became clear to me that these three most likely belonged to whatever staff, faculty, or hierarchy that existed here. Different colored robes, denoting different ranks, departments maybe? Clearly some sort of hierarchy, which means officials, staff, faculty, teachers. I thought to myself as I held up a single, suited hand and waved. Hi. I'm Emma. The new student from Earth? My whole body tensed as I spoke those words, realizing what I'd just done. I gave my speech before I arrived here, which means the first words ever spoken by a human in this new reality would be, "Oh God, what have I done?" It didn't take long, however, before the silence was promptly broken by the most striking figure in the group, a blue-robed elf, who immediately came to my side with an expression of growing concern. "Emma, was it? How are you feeling?" He seemed fixated on my helmet, tapping at the armor's composite chest plate before continuing in a voice that did little to hide his rising anxiousness. "I hear no breaths coming from her, through that suit of armor. See, can you breathe? If someone has gone wrong with this contraption, please inform me immediately so that we may take you to the infirmary in order to remove." Whoa, whoa, whoa. I raised up both hands defensively. The mere mention of removing the suit sent my survival training into overdrive as I took a few steps back, taking a moment to gather myself. I am fine. I feel fine at least. And the suit's fine as well. If I feel off or anything, I'll be sure to tell you, sir. I cocked my head, realizing that none of the three have yet to introduce themselves. Yes, the introductions. The black-robed one spoke next. This one was also elvish except darker, almost purple. A purple with a heavy hint of charcoal. Like someone had poured activated charcoal into grape soda. His hair was black, slick, and was formed back into two distinct locks. "I am council-appointed Professor Maltori. I am in charge of administrative duties relaying matters I deem of significance to the Privy Council and His Majesty the King himself. As a professor, I am in charge of the arts of perception and light." The man refused to acknowledge me in any other way than a piercing stare. I bowed my head all the same, though, not wanting to break any social faux pas on my first day. "And I am Professor Vanavan, assistant to the dean, and professor of Mana Field Studies." The blue-robed elf who had rushed up to me spoke, giving me half-nod before turning to the older, clearly winded red-robed professor. "This is Professor Bellner. She is in charge of the potions department and professor of potions crafting." He spoke, before raising both arms up a welcoming gesture. "We're happy to have you here, Emma of Earthrealm." Once introductions were firmly out of the way, I gave a firmer, deeper bow. The three responded with varying degrees of acknowledgement before Vanavan once more took charge of the group, gesturing for me to follow. "You will have to forgive me for the brashness and my outward concern. The fate of your predecessor still looms over the Academy like a specter of great shame, a tragedy that none of us wishes to see repeated. I have personally taken it upon myself to ensure that you do not suffer this fate. So long as you remain within my purview, within the walls of this academy, I will see to it that your life is free from harm. Vanavan spoke with a certain severity that sent chills down my spine. The polite, caring expression contrasted heavily with the intensity of his speech. Yet that intensity seemed to die down almost immediately as we left the foyer, now morphing to a more amicable, excitable expression. So, it is clear that we will have much to discuss regarding your uniform and your manner of dress, Emma of Earthrealm. Though we should make haste to the orientation first and foremost. Everyone has been waiting with bated breath for your safe and timely arrival. As the grand double doors of the foyer closed behind us, I took note as the black-robed professor seemed to linger behind, his eyes fixated on a small slit nestled high up in a far-flung corner of the room.